Hi, I'm Rabbi Marc, Kline, Monmouth Reformed Temple. This is Shabbat Shalom with a heart-healthy dose of Torah. Last week we read about the deaths of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, two young priests who brought a different fire to the altar than God had commanded, and they were consumed in the fire. And the rabbis launch into why it killed them, arguing they must have done something wrong because they died. Especially because the rest of the portion last week talked about not get drunk and don't eat these foods and don't act these ways. And so the rabbis just conveniently decided that because the rest of the Torah portion read the way it did, the boys must have been wrong. But I'm not sure that everyone agrees. There's many of us who argue that lots of times people have brought alien fire to the altar and have been consumed in that flame. If we look at any of the prophets who argued with the kings who ruled, quote, on behalf of God, end quote, we look at the justice leaders throughout history who have died as martyrs because they are fighting a corrupt system that rules on behalf of God. You know, we can see that there's a lot of abuse in the system, and the fact that someone marches to a beat of justice differently than the ones who are in power doesn't make them wrong. In fact, so much of the world that we do appreciate only happened because people brought an alien fire to the altar. So this week we change gears, sort of. This week we talk about something called sa'arat. And sa'arat is usually translated as leprosy, but it means skin affliction or affliction. The Yiddish, if anyone's out there, you've heard someone talk about having tsuris. This is kind of what that is. And in the Torah text, it says that if one has skin lesions, certain types, then the priest will decide who gets to stay in the camp and who has to leave the camp. And if the priest decides that the lesions are bad enough, then the afflicted's home and all belongings can be burned to the ground. It's a lot of power to put in one person. And certainly we need watchdogs, and certainly we need people to make sure that we operate in the best interests of society. But as I've just said, how many times throughout history has the power base decided who's in and who's out unjustly? And so I really wonder if this week's is a different text than last week, or whether we've now got a second week of the wrestling match, the debate between power and justice. And we know that equity happens when everybody is treated fairly, when people who have the power to make decisions actually do it in the best interest of the people they serve. You might even want to argue that this is an indictment on part of our own system, because when a person in power decides that a whole group of other people don't matter, then society is dysfunctional in the most horrific ways. We had a president in the White House decide that if you were Arab, you were a terrorist, and if you were Hispanic, you were a rapist and drug dealer. And then we have elections, and somehow people forget that when they're elected to serve, they don't represent just their party. They're supposed to be representing everybody. Lord Acton said, "Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely." And so perhaps this Torah portion, this week's, last week's, and by the way, next week's, call on us to remember that when we are empowered to represent people, there's a whole huge standard of ethics by which we have to abide. And we have to make sure that we don't do things the way we want them, that we do things the way that are in the best interest of all of society. And I would argue that whether we are elected officials or whether we are people in the regular world, we all are empowered to do just that, to take care of everyone around us. And when we decide that there's a first or second class person, we have violated God. So yeah, there are times that we need to make tough decisions on taking people from society for their benefit or for ours in dire straits. But we have to be really, really careful about how we exercise that power. Because if we abuse it, we all lose. So join us tonight, 7 o'clock, monmouthreformedtemple.org, as we celebrate Shabbat and count the the Omer, the ongoing offering that happens between Passover and Shavuot, so we can always bring our best fruits. And let's make sure that we are vigilant to make sure that we take care of each other. Take care. Shabbat Shalom.